There were no songs written about Kael Dravos. Songs required something the Pax were not willing to give him: admiration. What they gave him instead was a wide berth on every road, silence in every room he entered, and the particular quality of stillness that descended on a crowd when the thing it feared most stepped into its presence. He was 31 years old and he had ruled the combined territories of the 7 wolf kingdoms for 4 years. Before that he had spent 6 years taking them, one by one, in campaigns that the other Pax remembered in their nightmares. Not because he had been brutal in the way of kings who enjoyed violence, who used cruelty as a demonstration of power and called it governance. He had not been that. He had been something the Pax found more difficult to manage than cruelty. He had been precise. Exact. The kind of ruler who did not punish at random but who punished with a completeness that left no room for the hope that you might be the exception. No one had ever been the exception. The legend said he had yellow wolf eyes that could see through walls and through loyalty and through the darkest corner of any lie a wolf had ever told. The legend said he had not slept in 4 years because the dead he had made could not sleep and so neither could he. The legend said a great many things, and the thing about legends was that they were always edited by the people who needed the subject to be a certain kind of monster, and the truth was always messier and more human and considerably harder to tell in a way that made the telling satisfying. The truth about Kael Dravos was this: he was feared not because he was cruel but because he was right. Because he saw things exactly as they were, stripped of the comfortable interpretations that Pax used to make their hierarchies bearable, and because what he did with what he saw was never negotiable and never approximate. He was also, in the 4th year of his reign, conducting a silent and entirely private war against the specific loneliness of being the most powerful entity in a world that could not bear to be honest with him. He was losing that war. Until the morning an ambassador arrived from the last independent territory in the 7 kingdoms, a small mountain pack called Ashvale, carrying a treaty proposal he had not requested and a message written in a hand that was, unmistakably, the hand of someone who was not afraid of him. He read the message 3 times. Then he set it down and looked out the window of his throne room at the cold morning sky, and he did something he had not done in longer than he could trace back to an origin. He became curious. If this story has already found its grip on you, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe now and follow every chapter through to its end. Hit that subscribe button. Now let's begin the story. The court of the Alpha King did not receive visitors the way other courts received visitors. Other courts had ceremony. Welcome rituals, formal introductions conducted by officers of rank, the careful choreography of 2 parties establishing the terms of engagement before any substantive conversation occurred. Kael Dravos had eliminated that choreography in the 2nd month of his reign on the grounds that it told him nothing useful and consumed time he did not have. Visitors to the Dravos court were brought directly to the throne room, without preparation time, without the opportunity to compose themselves in an anteroom, without the advantage of knowing in advance how the space was arranged or where the king would be standing. Most visitors arrived already afraid. The direct delivery accelerated this. Lyra Vane arrived from Ashvale on the morning of the 41st day of autumn. She was 24. She was the daughter of the Ashvale Pack's oldest counselor, which was not a hereditary position and had not earned her this assignment. She had been sent because she had volunteered and because no one else in Ashvale had been willing to make the journey, and because the council had, after considerable internal debate, decided that a volunteer with uncertain odds was better than a conscript with certain failure. She had been traveling for 9 days through the mountain passes and then through the rolling lowland territories that surrounded the Dravos capital of Ironfall. She had used those 9 days to prepare, not in the way of someone memorizing a performance but in the way of someone thinking carefully about what was actually true and what she actually needed and what she was actually willing to do. The throne room of the Dravos palace was enormous and almost entirely undecorated. The other kingdoms she had read about in Ashvale's limited archive maintained throne rooms hung with banners and histories, the material evidence of lineage and continuity. The Dravos throne room had bare stone walls, iron sconces, and a floor so clean it reflected the morning light from the high windows like still water. It had a throne that was functional rather than symbolic, no carving, no ornamentation, stone with a single cushion in dark gray. The king was not sitting in it. He was standing at the far window with his back to the room, looking out at the mountain range visible through the glass. He did not turn when she was brought in. She used the 20 seconds of his continued attention to the window to observe him with the same systematic care she applied to every new environment. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that was not constructed for display but was the natural result of a body that had spent a decade in genuine combat. His hair was black, worn short enough to be entirely practical. His clothing was dark and unornamented, the kind of clothing that carried no statement except that its wearer had no interest in making one. He stood the way a wall stands, not aggressively present but simply, completely, there. He turned. His eyes were amber. Not yellow, as the legend said. Amber, the color of old resin with light moving through it, and they did the thing that amber eyes did in dominant wolves. They arrived before everything else and stayed after everything else had been absorbed. They came to her face and they held there with the level assessment of a man who had been reading people for 31 years and had found no one yet who was entirely what they appeared to be. She held his gaze. She did not step back. This produced a very small change in his expression. So small that someone less attentive than Lyra would have missed it. A fractional adjustment of the muscles around his eyes, the involuntary response to encountering an input that did not match the expected pattern. She filed it. He said, "Ashvale sent a girl." His voice was the voice of his reputation. Low, without inflection, carrying the particular authority of a register that had no need to raise itself because it had never been ignored. She said, "Ashvale sent its best option." The designation of girl is accurate in one dimension and imprecise in the others. Another fractional adjustment. This one she was more confident interpreting. He said, "You wrote the treaty proposal." She said, "Yes." He said, "The handwriting in the covering letter and the treaty text are the same. You also wrote the border assessment attached as Appendix 4. The analysis there contradicts the position the treaty proposes in Article 7. She said, "Yes." I included both because the contradiction seemed more useful to you than a consistent position that concealed the tension. You are going to govern whatever arrangement we reach. You should know where the pressure points are before you agree to anything. He looked at her. The assessment in his amber eyes was operating at a level she could feel rather than see. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, which she noted was not a dominance performance but a habit. He moved to the window side of the room and sat on the ledge, which was an entirely informal choice for a throne room, and looked at her with the full quality of his attention. He said, "What does Ashvale actually need?" She said, "Independence of governance for the internal pact decisions that do not affect border security or treaty obligations. The right to maintain our own counsel without Dravos appointed oversight. A trade corridor through the Eastern Pass that does not require a Dravos garrison presence." He said, "And what does Ashvale offer in exchange for these terms?" She said, "Full intelligence cooperation on the northern rogue movements. Ashvale sits at the single best observation point for the Northmark territories. We have been documenting rogue activity for 6 years. That archive is more comprehensive than anything your border patrols have been able to produce from the south." A silence. Not the silence of a man considering whether to agree. The silence of a man who had already done the calculation and was now doing something else. He said, "You know I could take Ashvale without a treaty." She said, "Yes. You could take it this winter. It would cost you 400 fighters and 6 weeks and a garrison of approximately 200 ongoing, and the intelligence cooperation would not survive the taking because the people who hold it would not cooperate with the garrison administration. You would have the territory and none of what makes the territory worth having. The treaty costs you the garrison and gives you the intelligence." She paused. Then, "I ran those numbers 3 times to make sure they were accurate before I made the journey. They are." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "You have been in this room for 11 minutes. She said, "Yes." He said, "No one in this room has held my gaze for 11 consecutive minutes in 4 years. She said, "I did not think looking away would improve my position." He said, "It would not have." He stood up from the window ledge and crossed the room to the table beside the throne and picked up the treaty document she had submitted 14 days ago through the formal channel. He held it. He said, "I will review the terms. You will remain in Ironfall during the review period. My staff will provide accommodation." She said, "How long is the review period?" He said, "As long as it requires." She said, "I have a follow-up question about Article 7 that may accelerate the review." He looked at her. She said, "The Appendix 4 analysis suggests the Eastern Pass Trade Corridor is more strategically significant to Dravos' interests than the treaty proposal acknowledges. If you are planning to use the corridor as a logistics route for the Northern Campaign, the garrison terms in Article 7 need revision before either of us signs anything, or you will be operating on a provision that functionally contradicts your own military strategy." A silence of a different quality. He said, "How do you know about the Northern Campaign?" She said, "The rogue activity documentation I mentioned. It tells a comprehensive story about where the threat is building. Any competent military strategist reading it would reach the same conclusion about timing and likely deployment routes." He said, "The documentation is in Ashvale." She said, "I have it here. I brought the relevant sections. I thought they might be useful." She reached into the leather case she had carried from Ashvale and placed a bound collection of reports on the table beside the treaty document. He looked at the reports. He looked at her. He said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard yet, something that was adjacent to but not identical to the flat authority she had been listening to since she entered, "You plan to use these as a negotiating lever in the second meeting, not the first." She said, "Yes." He said, "You deployed them in the first meeting instead." She said, "You asked what Ashvale actually needed." "I decided that a negotiation conducted on honest terms was more likely to produce a durable result than one conducted on strategic terms. That decision felt more important than the lever." He was entirely still for a moment. Then he picked up the bound reports and looked at the first page. He said, "You will join me for the evening meal. We will discuss Article 7. She said, "Yes, Alpha King." He said, "Kael." She looked at him. He said, "In direct conversation." "Kael." She said, "Lyra." He looked up from the reports and met her eyes for the third time, and this time the assessment in his amber gaze had moved slightly from its origin point, and she thought she knew where it was moving toward, though she filed the thought under observations requiring further evidence before any conclusion could be drawn. She had 9 days in Ironfall. Possibly more. She thought, with the measured portion of her attention that was not occupied with the treaty, that this was sufficient to gather considerably more evidence. Her accommodation was in the east wing of the Dravos Palace, which she understood to be a significant placement because the east wing was where the king's private council met and where the working departments of the kingdom's governance were housed. She was not placed in the guest quarters, which were in the south wing and were comfortable and entirely isolated from anything of substance. She spent the first afternoon reviewing the palace layout with the thoroughness she applied to all new environments, identifying the relevant corridors and the patterns of staff movement and the location of the library, which she found on the second floor of the east wing and which contained a working collection rather than a ceremonial one. No decorative bindings. Volumes organized by utility, military history beside territorial records beside economic analyses. She was reading the territorial record on the Northmark boundary when the king's second, a compact beta woman named Sov, appeared in the library doorway. Sov had been the first person in the palace to look at Lyra without the specific quality of pity that the palace staff seemed to have developed as a default expression for anyone who had an appointment with the king. Sov had looked at her with a measuring assessment that was professional rather than personal and had directed her to the east wing with the clean efficiency of someone who did not waste words. She said now, "The evening meal is in 40 minutes. The king does not keep to the formal dining room. He uses the map room for working meals." Lyra said, "Thank you." Sov hesitated. She said, "You should know that the last ambassador to use the phrase Alpha King in a direct address lost the goodwill of the meeting inside the first 5 minutes. He responds to the title in formal settings and finds it a performance in informal ones." Lyra said, "He told me to use Kael." Sov's measuring expression recalibrated by a degree. Then, 40 minutes. She left. Lyra held the territorial record and thought about the fact that the king had offered his name in the first meeting without being asked and that his second had found it notable enough to warn her against the title. She filed this under the growing body of evidence that the legend and the man were two substantially different things sharing a name. The map room was, like the throne room, functional to the point of severity. A long table with the map of the 7 kingdoms inlaid in its surface in careful detail, surrounded by chairs that were built for hours of use rather than for appearance, lit by iron chandeliers that were positioned to illuminate the table rather than the room. Kael was already there when she arrived, standing at the far end of the table with his hands braced on the inlaid surface, studying the Northmark region with the focused attention of someone holding a problem in 3 dimensions simultaneously. He did not look up immediately. She did not announce herself. She moved to the near side of the table and looked at the Northmark region from her angle, and she understood within 30 seconds what he was looking at and why the expression he wore when he finally registered her presence had the quality of a man interrupted from a calculation he had not finished. She said, "The rogue concentration is not static. It has been shifting southeast along the ridge line for 3 months. The reports I brought document the movement. By late spring it will have reached the junction at Stonefall, which is the only viable supply route for a northern campaign." He looked at her across the table. Then he looked at the map, then back to her. He said, "Show me." She moved to his side of the table and traced the documented movement pattern on the inlaid surface, referencing specific entries from the reports by memory because she had read them enough times to carry them accurately. He stood beside her and followed the trace, and she was aware, with the portion of her attention that was not occupied with the geography, that he had not moved away when she came to his side of the table and that the distance between them was the working distance of 2 people engaged with the same problem rather than the formal distance of an ambassador and a king. This was, she thought, a meaningful data point. He said, "The Stonefall Junction. Your pack's eastern pass connects to it." She said, "Yes. Which is why the Eastern Pass trade corridor is more strategically significant to your northern campaign than the treaty text acknowledges. Whoever controls the Ashvale Passage controls the last viable supply route if the rogues close the Stonefall Junction. A garrison administration of Ashvale does not give you that control, because a garrison administers by force and a force-administered population does not maintain the road infrastructure voluntarily. A treaty gives you the cooperation you would need to keep the passage functional under campaign conditions." He was looking at the map and she could not see his full expression, but she could see the side of his face and the set of his jaw, and what was in it was not the flat authority she had been reading since the morning. It was something more interior. The quality of a man arriving at a conclusion he had already been moving toward and finding it confirmed. He said, "You built this entire case before you arrived?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You brought documentation that served my interest as well as Ashvile's." She said, "A treaty that only serves one party does not remain a treaty. It becomes a point of contention. I am interested in a durable arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did Ashvale send you specifically?" She said, "I volunteered." He said, "No one volunteers for this. I have sent 4 summons to packs less independent than Ashvale in the past 18 months. None of them sent a volunteer. All 4 sent the person they were least concerned about losing." She considered whether to answer this honestly. She decided that honest answers had served her well so far. She said, "Ashvale sent me because I asked to come, and because the council trusted my judgment well enough to let me make the case, and because I believed the outcome of this negotiation mattered too much to be handled by someone who considered it a sacrifice." He turned from the map and looked at her directly. The amber eyes at close range were, she noted in the part of her that was responsible for honest accounting, extraordinary. Not intimidating in the way the legends described. Precise. The eyes of someone for whom seeing clearly was not a skill but a compulsion. He said, "What did you believe the outcome would be when you arrived?" She said, "I believed it was 50-50 and that the margin was determined entirely by whether the king was the person the legends described or a more complex version of that person." He said, "And now?" She said, "The margin has shifted." A silence. He looked at her with those precise amber eyes, and she looked back without dropping her gaze, and the room was quiet except for the fire in the iron grate and the distant sound of the palace going about its evening work. He said, "No one tells me the truth." The statement came without inflection, without the performance of complaint or self-pity. It arrived as a pure observation, delivered with the same quality as the territorial analysis. "Here is a fact, here is its relevance, I am setting it on the table." She said, "I noticed that. The way your staff speaks in the corridors when they do not think you are within range, the way your council members phrase things in the meetings I passed on the way to the library this afternoon. Everything is filtered. Everything is shaped to the expected response before it arrives." He said, "You were listening to my council meetings." She said, "The door was open and I walked quietly. I did not intend to overhear. Once I had begun to overhear, I decided stopping would waste the information." Something happened in his expression. Something that was not the fractional adjustment she had been cataloging since the morning. Something larger, contained quickly but not quickly enough for someone who had been watching his face with the attention she had been giving it. He said, "What did you hear?" She said, 3 council members spent 40 minutes discussing how to present a logistical failure in the southern supply chain in terms that would not produce a negative reaction from you. The actual failure took approximately 4 sentences to describe. The other 36 minutes were the architecture of management. He said, "Yes." She said, "The logistical failure in question, if I am reading the supply chain maps correctly, is solvable with a rerouting that does not require new resources. Someone has already worked this out, based on a note visible on the secondary map on the east wall, but the person who worked it out has not presented it yet." He turned to look at the east wall. He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked to the secondary map and looked at the note she had referenced. He read it. He came back to the table. He said, "Who wrote that note?" She said, "Based on the handwriting visible from the doorway, someone who writes with their left hand and presses hard on the downstrokes. Your secondary map administrator, based on the work assignments on the posting board outside the map room, is a left-handed junior officer named Fun." He looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely outside the categories she had been cataloging. He said, "You have been in this palace for 6 hours." She said, "I pay attention." He said, "No. You do something more than that. What you do is the thing that most people cannot do, which is to receive information as information rather than as something that needs to be fitted into an existing framework." She said, "My father taught me that frameworks are useful until they are not, and the sign that they have stopped being useful is that you stop being able to see the things that do not fit them." He said, "Your father is the Ashvale Council elder." She said, "He was. He died 2 years ago. The council retained the position in his name while I finished the work he had started on the Northmark documentation. It was his project originally. He had been watching the rogue movements since before I understood the significance. He was quiet. The quality of his quiet was different from all the previous qualities of his quiet." He said, "I am going to ask you something I have not asked any ambassador in 4 years of receiving them." She waited. He said, "What do you actually think of me? Not the treaty position. Not the strategic assessment. What you think, personally, of the Alpha King whose court you are sitting in." She looked at him for a long moment. She considered the honest answer. She considered whether the honest answer was, in this instance, the optimal answer. She concluded, as she had in the morning, that a negotiation conducted on honest terms was more likely to produce a durable result. She said, "I think you are in the position of a man who solved the problems he could solve with force and is now facing the problems that force cannot address, and that the loneliness of the position is not incidental to it but structural. I think the reputation that makes the kingdom functional is also the thing that makes genuine counsel impossible. I think you knew what the southern supply chain solution was before you walked into this room tonight because you always know, and that knowing alone is exactly as isolating as it sounds." The fire in the grate shifted. The palace was entirely quiet. He said, "That is the most accurate description of the past 4 years that anyone has given me." She said, "I am sorry for it." He said, Do not apologize for accuracy. It is the one thing I am never sorry for. They ate the working meal. They discussed Article 7. The revision was straightforward once both of them had named the actual strategic stakes, which took 11 minutes. The remaining 2 hours were conversation that was, technically, still about the treaty and was, also, something else entirely, and both of them were aware of the second thing and neither of them named it, which was a kind of naming in itself. She spent the next 3 days in the East Wing library and the map room and the corridors of the palace that connected them, building her working knowledge of the Dravos court with the same patient systematic attention she had applied to every complex environment in her professional life. The palace, she found, was a more accurate portrait of the king than any legend had managed. The absence of ornamentation was not austerity for its own sake but a deep disinterest in the performance of power, the same disinterest that had placed him on the window ledge in the first meeting rather than the throne. The working collection in the library rather than a ceremonial one. The map room for meals rather than the formal dining hall. Everything chose function over signal, and the signal this sent, for those paying attention, was of a man who was entirely confident that what he was needed no staging. She also observed the court. The council members who arrived at meetings carrying the careful postures of wolves who had learned to manage their expressions before they crossed the threshold. The officers who gave their reports in the specific language of people who had discovered the cost of the wrong word and had rebuilt their vocabularies accordingly. The junior staff who moved in the corridors with the eyes-forward attention of workers in an environment where visibility was a risk. She had expected to find oppression. She found something more complicated, a court that was functional, even effective, and that was also held in the grip of a fear that was not entirely unreasonable because the king was, in fact, the man the reputation suggested. He was precise. He was unforgiving of failure that came from carelessness or dishonesty. He was not cruel, but he was exacting, and in a court where exacting was the worst available fate, fear was a reasonable adaptation. What she had not expected to find was that the king knew this. That he saw the management in every interaction and the distance it imposed, and that he carried this knowledge as the particular weight of a person who has achieved what they set out to achieve and discovered it to be both necessary and insufficient. She found this on the 4th day when she arrived at the map room for the morning session and found him already there, sitting in a chair with his elbows on his knees, looking at the inlaid map surface without reading it. He heard her at the door and straightened, and the transition from what she had seen to the contained authority that greeted her took less than a second and was nearly invisible. She said, "You have been here since before the staff arrived." He said, "I sleep poorly." She said, "The Northern campaign planning." He said, "Among other things." She moved to the near chair and sat and looked at the map, and he remained in his chair, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. And the silence had the texture of two people who have found an unusual and specific kind of ease in each other's company and are not certain what to do with it yet. She said, "The Northmark intelligence in the reports I brought. There are patterns in the movement data that suggest the rogue collective is not, as your border patrols have been assessing, a territorial expansion movement. The concentration points are not consistent with territorial acquisition. They are consistent with a gathering. Something is being assembled." He said, "Something." She said, "The reports document 3 separate instances of high-ranking rogues arriving at the concentration zone rather than originating from it. Leadership, not rank and file. And the timing correlates with cycles in the Northmark weather patterns in a way that suggests whoever is organizing this understands the operational environment well enough to time movements around the seasonal windows." He said, "You are telling me the rogues have a commander." She said, "I am telling you the movement data is consistent with having a commander. The inference is yours to make." He stood and moved to the map. She stood beside him. They stood over the Northmark region for a long time, and she walked him through the documentation pattern by pattern, and he received it with the quality of attention she had observed since the first day, the total reception that did not filter and did not manage, that took information as information. He said at one point, not lifting his gaze from the map, "How long did your father spend on this?" She said, 11 years. "I spent the last 4 with him. The last 2 completing it after he was gone." He said, "He was building a case." She said, "He believed this was coming." He wanted there to be a record accurate enough that whoever needed to respond to it would be able to respond correctly. He said, he was building it for me. She was quiet. He said, the timing of the Asheville Treaty proposal. 14 days after your Northern Intelligence Archive reached the level of documentation required to support a military strategy. That is not coincidental. She said, no. It is not. He looked at her. The amber eyes, close, in the morning light. He said, your father intended for this to come to me. She said, he believed you were the only king in the 7 kingdoms with the capability and the willingness to address what was coming. He spent 11 years watching the kingdoms and their rulers, and that was his conclusion. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, he never met me. She said, he read everything. He was very good at reading. Another silence. Something in it had a different quality from all the silences before it, the quality of information that has traveled a long way through the hands of someone who believed in its destination and has finally arrived. He said, quietly, I wish I had known him. She said, he would have said the feeling was mutual. The morning light moved across the inlaid surface of the map, across the careful rendering of the 7 kingdoms and the blank spaces to the north where the Northmark territories were documented only partially, and they stood in it together, and she felt the warmth of it and made no attempt to manage the feeling. On the 5th day, the court decided it had an opinion. Lyra had expected this. Courts were organisms and their primary function was the management of proximity to power. An outsider spending daily time with the king, including working meals and morning sessions that lasted well past what treaty review required, was a variable the organism needed to assess and respond to. The assessment arrived in the form of Counselor David Moore, the most senior of Kael's 3 strategic advisors, who appeared in the East Wing library with the composed expression of a man executing a predetermined plan. He was 60, with the bearing of a wolf who had served in 3 administrations and had survived the transitions by understanding exactly how much power he actually held and spending none of it carelessly. He sat across from Lyra with the quality of courtesy that is a form of control, and he said, the ambassador from Ashevale has made considerable progress on the treaty negotiations. She said, the king and I are aligned on the primary articles. Article 9 remains in discussion. He said, the king finds you useful. She said, I hope so. That is the purpose of an ambassador. He said, the king has not found anyone useful in a personal capacity for a considerable period. The council is attentive to changes in that pattern. She looked at him with the expression she used for statements that were carrying more content than their surface language. She said, I am negotiating a treaty on behalf of Ashevale. That is the full scope of my presence here. He said, of course. I mention the council's attentiveness simply as context. The Alpha King's previous personal connections have not ended in ways that benefited the parties involved. This was a specific statement designed to land in a specific place, and she received it as such. She said, I appreciate the context. I want to offer some in return. I have been in this palace for 5 days. I have observed a council that spends considerable energy managing information before it reaches the king. I understand why, given the environment that has developed around his leadership. I also think that environment is one of the most significant strategic vulnerabilities this kingdom carries, because a king who does not receive accurate counsel cannot make accurate decisions, and accurate decisions are the thing this king's rule is built on. Counselor Moore looked at her. His composed expression had developed a hairline fracture. She said, if the council's concern is that I will produce a disruption, the more productive concern is what the disruption of accurate information might produce in a positive direction. I am not a threat to this court. I am an ambassador from a small mountain pack who wants a treaty that works. Everything else is observation. He stood. He said, you are very direct, Ambassador Vane. She said, I have found it more efficient. He left. She returned to the territorial records. She did not tell Kael about the visit. He found out through his own channels and arrived in the library an hour later with the flat authority expression at full expression, which she had learned was his face for anger that was being managed rather than displayed. He said, Moore spoke to you. She said, yes. He was conducting an assessment. It is his function. He said, what he said to you was outside his function. She said, he was protecting the court as he understands it. I do not think it requires a response. He looked at her with an expression that was not his management of anger face anymore. He said, you are defending him. She said, I am providing context. He operates from a genuine concern for the stability of a court he has served for 20 years. The method was not ideal. The instinct was not dishonorable. He sat in the chair across from her. He sat with his elbows on the arms of the chair and his fingers loosely folded, and he looked at her, and the amber eyes were doing the thing they did when he was thinking rather than performing, when the precision was turned inward rather than outward. He said, what did he actually say? She said, that your previous personal connections did not end well for the parties involved. It was a warning. He wanted me to step back from the personal dimension of our time together. The room was quiet. He said, there is a personal dimension. She said, I think that has been apparent to both of us since approximately the second day. I did not think naming it served the negotiation. He said, and now? She said, the treaty articles are effectively resolved. Article 9 is the last outstanding point, and I expect we will reach agreement on it tomorrow. Which means the professional justification for not naming things is going to expire. He looked at her for a long time. The morning light from the library windows was the thin autumn gold that the mountain territories produced at this latitude and season, and it lay across the table between them and across the old territorial records and across his hands, and she was doing the thing she had been quietly doing for 5 days, holding the full account of what she observed of him against the legend she had arrived with, and finding the distance between the two not bridgeable in words but only in the slow accumulation of evidence that she was conducting with the same patient attention she gave to everything worth understanding. He said, the previous connections more referenced. 2. Both within the first year of my rule. Both ended by the other party when the reality of what my life required became clear. I do not hold that against them. What I hold is the education. She said, what education? He said, that the position I hold does not leave room for what most people need from a personal connection. The availability. The consistency of presence. The capacity to be something other than the alpha king in every hour of every day. She said, that sounds like a conclusion you reached and then did not examine again. He said, it has held for 3 years. She said, 3 years of evidence gathered from no new attempts is not evidence. It is the absence of evidence, which is a different thing. He looked at her. She said, I am not most people. I am not interested in the availability or the consistency that you are describing. I am interested in the thing I have been observing for 5 days, which is a person of genuine intelligence and genuine principle who is carrying an isolation that is so complete it has become structural, and who does not know what to do with someone who sees it. He said, what do you do with it? She said, I am a negotiator. I look for the arrangement that serves both parties. I am not certain yet what that arrangement is here. I know that I am not afraid of your reputation, I am not afraid of your ambition, and I am not afraid of the demands your position places on your life. Those were the things that ended the previous connections. They are not the things I am working with. He was very still. She said, I have 7 days left in Ironfall after the treaty is signed. I would like to spend them understanding what the arrangement might be. Without agenda and without the treaty as a framework. He said, and then you return to Ashvale. She said, yes. Which is 3 days' travel from Ironfall, on a road I would be traveling regularly once the trade corridor is active. He looked at her and she held his gaze, as she had held it since the first morning, and the fire in the grate was the only sound in the library, and she was not managing any of what she was feeling, which was new, and she had decided it was the correct approach, which was also new, and she held it all with the same patient deliberate attention she held everything. He said, yes. She said, yes to the 7 days. He said, yes to whatever comes after them. Article 9 was resolved the following morning in 22 minutes, which was faster than she had projected but consistent with the trajectory of the negotiation overall. The revision she proposed addressed the specific ambiguity in the passage rights clause that had been the sticking point, and he accepted the revision without the counter-proposal she had prepared because the revision was, as she had constructed it to be, genuinely more favorable to both parties than the original text. Sov drafted the final treaty document. Kael signed it at the long map table. Lyra signed it beside his signature and pressed the Ashvale Council seal into the wax and looked at the two names beside each other and thought about her father, who had spent 11 years building toward this moment and had not been present for it, and she held the feeling with the honesty she tried to give everything. She said, he would have been satisfied. Kael was looking at the treaty document. He said, the work he did will be the foundation of the Northern strategy. His name belongs on the military record. She said, he would not have wanted that. He would have wanted the strategy to work. He said, then I will make sure it does. She believed him. She had believed him since the second day, which was earlier than was strictly defensible on the evidence, but she had learned to trust the conclusions she reached before she could fully articulate their evidence, because they were usually the result of processing she had done correctly at a level below where articulation operated. She folded her copy of the treaty into the leather case. She looked at him across the map table. She said, 7 days. He said, 7 days. The 7 days were not what she had expected. She had expected them to carry the quality of a negotiation conducted by other means, structured, purposeful, each exchange building toward a defined end. What they carried instead was the quality of something that had no end point because it was not moving toward one, that was simply present in itself, and the present was sufficient. On the first day after the treaty signing they walked the palace grounds, which were extensive and largely wild, the formal gardens that previous kings had maintained having been allowed to grow back under Kael's tenure into something closer to forest than landscape. He said, when she noted this, I preferred the forest. She said, there is a large-scale topographical principle in that statement. He said, there is. I have been thinking about it. She said, tell me. He said, the formal gardens required constant management to remain what they were. The effort of keeping something shaped to an ideal consumes resources that would otherwise go to the thing itself. The forest requires different management. Acknowledgement of what it is rather than enforcement of what it should be. She said, you are describing a governing philosophy. He said, I am describing something I am working toward. The governing philosophy I have been using is closer to the formal garden. It has been effective and it is also costly in a way I am becoming less willing to sustain. She walked beside him through the undergrowth that had reclaimed the paths and she thought about what he had said and about the king who had taken 7 kingdoms by force and was standing in his own overgrown gardens talking about the cost of shaped ideals. She said, what would the forest version of your rule look like? He said, more accurately described. I have been enforcing a version of order that works but that requires every wolf in this court to be afraid of the cost of failure. The order is real. The failure that produces the cost is real. But fear as the mechanism produces the management problem you observed on your first day, the shaping of information before it arrives. I am not certain yet what the alternative mechanism is. She said. Accountability without catastrophe. He said, explain that. She said, the court is afraid of catastrophic consequences for errors. That fear is rational given the history. But catastrophic consequences for honest errors are not a sustainable governance model, because they eliminate the honesty you need to govern correctly. The alternative is not the absence of consequences. It is consequences calibrated to the nature of the error. Carelessness and dishonesty remain costly. Honest errors, reported honestly, become the material of improvement rather than punishment. He was quiet for a moment. He said, that is a description of a court I have not yet built. She said, the overgrown garden is the beginning of the forest. It is not the destination. He looked at her, in the dappled autumn light of the reclaimed grounds, with the expression she had been cataloging since the first day and now had a complete definition for. It was the expression of a man who was being heard clearly for the first time in a very long time and was deciding, in real time, how much of himself to extend toward that. He said, how long have you been thinking about governance? She said, my father's work was intelligence documentation. My work, underneath the documentation, was the question of what the documentation was for. What it would be used to build. I had been thinking about what good rule looks like since I was old enough to see the distance between what it could be and what it was. He said, and the Alpha King everyone feared. She said, sits in the distance between what rule is and what it could be. As everyone who has ever governed does. The distance in your case is complicated by the scale and by the mechanism. But it is not different in kind. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He said, "You are the first person who has spoken to me as though I am the same kind of thing they are." She said, "You are. The scale is different. The kind is the same." He turned to her in the wild garden and looked at her with the full quality of his attention, all of it, the precision and the intelligence and the thing underneath those that she had observed in pieces since the first morning and was now seeing completely for the first time. The loneliness that was not self-pity but was simply the accurate accounting of a man who had been alone in the most important ways for 4 years and was standing in front of the first person who had changed that arithmetic. He reached out and touched her face. Not claiming. Not demanding. The touch of someone who was asking a question with their hands because the words were inadequate. She leaned into it. That was the answer. On the third day they shifted together. She had not known this would happen. She had not known he shifted for personal reasons rather than tactical ones, because the legend gave no account of the Alpha King as a wolf rather than a king, and she had not thought to ask. He came to the library door in the early morning and said, "Come." She followed him through the palace and out through the east garden gate and through the wild grounds and through the tree line into the forest that began where the palace grounds ended and continued for 10 kilometers before it reached the first boundary of the territory. The morning was cold and the light was the particular clean quality of mountain autumn, the air sharp enough to carry scent further than usual and still enough to make sound precise. He stopped in a clearing where the trees opened to show the mountains to the north and he shifted. She had seen dominant wolves shift. The shift of a dominant wolf was a muscular event, fast and contained, the body moving through the change with the efficiency of something that had done it 10,000 times. His shift was different from dominance in degree and kind. It was immediate and complete, the way a fire is complete when it reaches a fuel source, a release rather than an execution. One moment the Alpha King of the 7 kingdoms stood in the clearing. The next, a black wolf. She had not been told. He was enormous. Not in the exaggerated scale of the legends but in the genuine scale of a wolf whose physical expression matched the weight of what it was. The black coat carried no markings and no variation, pure and absolute, and the amber eyes that she had been reading since the morning of the first day were the same amber in wolf form, carrying the same precision, the same quality of full and unmediated reception. He looked at her. She shifted. Her wolf was a dark chestnut, the color of deep forest earth in autumn, with a white mark at the base of the throat. She was not small, not for an ambassador's daughter who had spent most of her adult life sitting with documents, but beside him she was proportioned the way a mountain stream is proportioned beside the mountain, correctly to scale. He moved and she moved with him, and the 10 kilometers of forest unfolded under their motion, and she understood, in the wolf state where understanding was sensory rather than analytical, why the Alpha King who governed the 7 kingdoms from a bare stone throne needed this. The forest had no agenda. The trees did not manage their expressions before he arrived. The cold air told him exactly what was in it. The territory received his presence without adjusting itself around his reputation. She ran beside him and she felt the clean specific joy of a body doing the thing it was designed for, and she felt, alongside it, the thing that was different when the running was beside someone rather than alone, the particular warmth of parallel motion, 2 wolves covering the same ground from the same direction, and she let it be what it was without managing it. They ran for 2 hours. They came back to the clearing and shifted and stood in the cold morning with the forest behind them and the mountains ahead, breathing, and she looked at him and he looked at her and neither of them said anything because everything that needed saying had been said by the running. He said eventually, "This is the first time I have run with another wolf in 4 years." She said, "Why?" He said, "The court wolves treat it as a tactical exercise. The patrol wolves treat it as a duty. The last person I ran with freely was someone who was no longer in the kingdom." She said, "Would run with you again." He said, yes. The morning was brilliant and cold and complete. On the 5th day the Northern Intelligence produced its crisis. A patrol report arrived from the Northmark border that confirmed what the Ashvale documentation had been building toward, a coordinated movement. Not a gathering anymore. A deployment. 1,200 rogues moving southeast in 3 columns, timed to converge at the Stonefall Junction within 6 days. Kael called the full council. The map room was filled for the first time since her arrival with the complete strategic and military leadership of the 7 kingdoms, and she understood as she moved to step back from this, because this was not her meeting, that he was going to need everything the Ashvale archive contained and he was going to need it now. He said, to the room, before she had fully stepped back, Lyra. She stopped. He said, stay. The Northmark documentation is yours. Walk the council through the movement patterns. Counselor Moore looked at her from across the room with an expression that had moved entirely outside the composed assessment she had received from him on day 5. She moved to the map table. She walked the council through the documentation with the precision she had used with Kael in the one-on-one sessions, but at the scale the council required, the full strategic picture, the convergence timing, the logical counter-deployment, the role of the Ashvale passage in the supply chain the campaign would require. The council received it. The military officers began building response plans in real time, working against the map surface, and the quality of the room was focused in the way of people who are doing necessary work with good material. After the session, when the council had dispersed to their deployment tasks, Kael said to her, "You just briefed the full strategic council of the 7 kingdoms." She said, "The documentation required it." He said, "The documentation required that the information be in the room." "The briefing required you." She said, "My father built the archive. I only carried it." He said, "You did more than carry it. The analysis in that briefing, the convergence timing assessment, the supply chain mapping, that was not in the archive documents. You built that from the documents in the past 5 days." She said, "I had access to the palace strategic records and your military deployment history. The analysis followed from combining the sources." He looked at her with the expression that was complete now, that she had the full definition of, and what was in it alongside the precision and the recognition and the warmth was something that was present in the expression of anyone standing in front of something they have decided to keep. He said, "Stay." She said, "Ashvale." He said, "The treaty you negotiated gives Ashvale full governance independence. The council will retain its function. The trade corridor will be managed by your people. What I am asking is not for the territory. It is for you." She looked at him. She thought about the 9 days of travel from the mountain passes and the 11 minutes of the first meeting and the 5 days of the negotiation and the 7 days that were now 5, and the running in the forest, and the morning in the map room over the inlaid surface with the winter light coming through the east windows, and the library and the fire and the sessions that went past what the treaty required. She said, "I will need time in Ashvale. The council transition, the trade corridor implementation. The past documentation." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you will be managing a northern campaign." He said, "Yes." She said, "Honest counsel. Unfiltered. That is what I bring. Not ceremony and not the management of information before it arrives. If you want someone to shape what you hear into what is comfortable, I am the wrong person." He said, "I am aware of that. It is not a disqualification." She said, "It is the basis." He said, "Then yes. That is the basis." She said, "Then yes." The northern campaign began on the 48th day of autumn. Kael led it himself, which was not what the council had recommended and was not the decision Lyra had argued against, because she understood that the Alpha King leading from the front was not a performance. It was the specific expression of a commitment that could not be made any other way. When the kingdom required its full weight behind something, the full weight included him. She returned to Ashvale on the 42nd day. She rode the mountain passes with the same small escort she had arrived with, and she arrived in the council hall with the signed treaty and the full briefing on the northern situation, and the council listened to all of it, and then the senior member, old Carver, who had occupied the chair beside her father's empty one for 2 years, said, "You succeeded. She said, the treaty achieved its objectives. He said, and the other thing. She looked at him. He said, your father was very specific about what he hoped this journey would produce. He said if the king was the man he believed him to be, the treaty would be the beginning of something larger. She said, he sent me to negotiate a treaty. He said, he sent you because he believed you and the king would recognize each other. He said it to me 2 months before he died. He said the only thing that worried him was whether the timing would be right. She was quiet for a long moment. The council hall was warm with the fire her father had always kept burning in the winter months, the same stones, the same timber ceiling, the same mountains visible through the high window. She said, the timing was right. Carver said, good. He would have been very satisfied. She spent 3 weeks in Ashevale completing the transition work. The trade corridor implementation was straightforward, the Ashevale infrastructure was already built for it. Her father had been planning for this possibility and had laid the groundwork. The council governance transition took slightly longer because the Ashevale Council had been functioning under a formal vacancy since her father's death and the structure needed formalizing before the new independence terms could be properly exercised. She wrote to Kael every 4 days. He wrote back within a day of each letter arriving, which given the campaign tempo was not nothing. His letters were what his speech was. Direct, without ceremony, carrying the precise quality of his attention even on paper. He described the campaign situation in terms that were strategically frank to a degree that his counsel would have found concerning if they had known the content of the correspondence. She understood this was a choice, that he was practicing the thing they had named, honest counsel unfiltered, and she received it with the same quality she received everything he gave her. She wrote back with equal frankness. The Ashevale Council position on the northern operation, the past conditions as the autumn deepened toward winter, the state of the intelligence archive, which she was continuing to update as the rogue movement data continued to flow in. She also wrote about the mountains and the mornings in the Ashevale Hall and the fire her father had kept burning. She wrote about the small things that were not strategic information but that were the texture of a life he had not been present for, and she did this because the honest counsel they had named as their basis extended to the things that were not about governance. He wrote about the northern forest at night. The quality of silence in the campaign camp after the day's operations. A conversation with a junior officer who had solved the supply routing problem with an approach no one had tried before and whom he had promoted on the spot, which the council was going to have a position on and he was going to hear that position and then maintain the promotion. He wrote about the black wolf in the forest and the specific quality of running alone and what the difference was. She read that particular passage 3 times and then put the letter in the case with the others and continued her work. The campaign reached its decisive phase in the 59th day of autumn. The 3 rogue columns had converged as projected at the Stonefall Junction, which gave the rogue commander the supply advantage, but what the Ashevale documentation had built was the counter-strategy that the deployment had been planned around. The Dravos forces had positioned at the 3 high points that commanded the junction from above, not to engage the concentration directly but to deny the rogue force the lateral movement that would have made the concentration viable. Cut off from expansion, supplied from a single point, 1,200 rogues in a static position was a different problem from 1,200 rogues in a moving one. The engagement lasted 3 days. The rogue commander was identified and brought to a direct confrontation on the 2nd day, which was the outcome the strategy had been designed to produce, because a commanded force without its commander was not the same force. Kael fought the commander himself. This was also not what the council had recommended and also not what she had argued against, because she understood the specific grammar of this kind of leadership. Some things only meant something if the person at the top of the structure was willing to be at the front of the thing they were asking others to do. He won. This was not surprising to her. What was in the letter he wrote afterward, 3 days after the engagement when the cleanup operations were complete and the rogue force had been dispersed or surrendered, was something she had not been prepared for even though she might have been. He wrote, the moment after, in the cleared junction, I stood in the silent field and I looked north. The first time I have looked north without seeing the problem I have been solving for 4 years. There was nothing there except the mountains and the beginning of the winter dark in the sky. I thought about the forest. I thought about the running. I thought, specifically, about the sound of 2 wolves covering the same ground in the same direction, which I have been carrying since the morning of the third day and which has not diminished with the distance. He wrote, "Come back to Iron Fall." She wrote back the same day, "The pass work is finished. The council is constituted. The archive is current. I will be there in 9 days." She arrived on the 58th day after she had left, which was in the deep cold of early winter, the mountains in full white, the road through the low territories carrying the particular cold clarity of the season. The palace at Iron Fall was the same. The bare stone throne room, the functional East Wing library, the wild grounds that were now winter-stripped and beautiful in the stripped way of things that do not depend on foliage for their structure. The map room with its inlaid surface. She was shown to the East Wing accommodation, which was still her room, unchanged. She went to the library. He was there. Sitting at the reading table with a campaign report and a cup of something warm, looking at the text with the focused expression that was the same as the first time she had seen it, the precision directed inward at a problem. He looked up. He said, 9 days. She said, the pass was cooperative. He said, sit down. She sat across from him, in the chair that was hers now in the specific way that furniture becomes yours in places you intend to stay. They sat in the library in the winter morning and the fire in the grate was steady and the palace was doing its work around them and outside the window the stripped wild grounds held the cold with the calm of things that understand that winter is not permanent but are not in a hurry about it. He said, the council has a position on the arrangement we discussed. She said, I expected that. He said, Moore's position is that the arrangement is irregular and sets a precedent that complicates the formal court hierarchy. She said, what did you say? He said, I said that the formal court hierarchy was producing a governance problem I had been trying to solve for 4 years and that I intended to address it, and that the arrangement was not irregular but was instead a correction that the irregular environment had made necessary. She said, how did he receive that? He said. He asked what the correction was specifically. I told him honest counsel without management. He asked how that was structurally different from what the council currently provided. I told him I would demonstrate the difference over the following months and he was welcome to compare the outcomes. She said, that is a reasonable answer. He said, he seemed to find it so. He also said, before he left, that Ambassador Vane had told him she was not a threat to this court. He said he believed this was accurate. She said, it was accurate when I said it. He said, and now? She said, now I am something more permanent than an ambassador, which is a different relationship to the court. Whether that constitutes a threat depends on what the court decides to do with the honest counsel. He looked at her across the reading table with the complete expression, the full definition, the thing she had been building the definition of since the first morning in the throne room when he had turned from the window and found her not stepping back. He said, I need to say something clearly. She said, say it. He said, I have been the Alpha King everyone feared for 4 years. I have been precise and I have been unforgiving and I have been the kind of ruler that the kingdoms required and that I was willing to be because I believed it was necessary. I still believe it was necessary. I also believe, standing on the other side of the northern campaign with the Northmark secure and the rogues dispersed and the treaty archive that your father built finally bearing the weight it was designed to bear, that the governance I have been practicing has reached the end of what it can produce alone. He said, you said the overgrown garden is the beginning of the forest and not the destination. I have been standing in the overgrown garden for 3 years calling it the forest. I think, with you in this court and in this conversation and on the roads between here and Ashvale for as long as the work takes, I think I understand what the actual forest looks like. She said, tell me. He said, accountability without catastrophe. Counsel that arrives unfiltered. A court that tells the truth to its king because the king has demonstrated that truth is the thing he responds to, not the performance of it. A king who runs in the forest with someone who is not afraid of him and comes back to the court changed by it. He said, I cannot build that alone. I have been trying to. She said, I know. He said, I am asking you, specifically, to build it with me. Not as an ambassador. Not as a strategic asset. As the person I intend to deserve. The fire in the grate shifted. The winter light lay across the reading table and across the old territorial records and across his hands folded on the table's surface and across the 9 days of road that had brought her back to this room. She said, "I had been building toward this answer since my father first told me what he was constructing the archive for." He said, "There will come a time when the right king has the right intelligence and needs the right person to help him understand what to do with it." He said, "That person is you, if you are willing." She said, "I am willing." He reached across the table and she met him halfway, and that was the architecture of it. The thing she had told him was the basis. Honest counsel, equal distance, both parties meeting the other without agenda and without managed information in the way of two wolves running the same ground from the same direction. The palace went on around them. The 7 kingdoms went on outside the window. The northern territories were quiet for the first time in 11 years. The threat her father had spent his life documenting addressed with the precision that was the best version of the king she had found beneath the reputation. The fear the Alpha King carried would not disappear. It was part of the instrument of governance and it had not been misapplied. But it would not be the whole of the instrument anymore, and the court that grew in the space the fear was no longer the only thing filling would be something closer to the forest, complex, self-sustaining, oriented toward its own continuance rather than toward the management of catastrophe. She picked up the territorial records she had been reading. He went back to his campaign report. They worked in the winter library and the fire held steady and outside the stripped wild grounds lay under the cold with the patience of things that know the spring is coming, and the 7 kingdoms, slowly and without announcement, began the long process of becoming something that had always been possible and that had required exactly this: the right intelligence, the right king, and the right person willing to make the journey. A year and a half after the signing of the Ashvale Treaty, the court of the Alpha King Kael Dravos was a recognizably different thing from what it had been. The changes were not dramatic. The throne room was still bare stone. The library was still a working collection. The king still moved with the contained authority of a man who had earned it through consequence rather than ceremony and had no interest in the performance of what he already was. What was different was the quality of the rooms. The council met with a different texture. The meetings were shorter and covered more ground because the pre-meeting management of information had decreased over the months as the council discovered, incrementally and with the specific caution of people adjusting a habit that had kept them safe, that honest reporting produced responses calibrated to the actual problem rather than to the managed version. Junior Officer Fun, who had written the supply rerouting solution on the secondary map, was now a senior logistics officer. She had filed 7 direct reports in 8 months, each one unceremonious and each one acted on. The court had noticed. Moore had not retired his caution. He was 61 and his caution was as structural as the stone walls. But the hairline fracture Lyra had produced in the 6th day of her first visit had, over 18 months, developed into something larger, and what was coming through it was not destabilization but something closer to what she had described to the king in the overgrown garden. Acknowledgement of what things were rather than enforcement of what they should be. She spent her time between Iron Fall and Ashvale and the rhythm the work required. The trade corridor was operational. The Ashvale Council governed its internal matters with the independence the treaty guaranteed. The Northmark documentation continued, updated now by a team of 4 trained specifically in her father's methodology, and the archive was maintained with the same precision he had brought to it and that she had carried in his absence. She moved between the mountain passes and the winter library and the wild palace grounds and the map room where the campaign planning for the ongoing Northmark consolidation occupied the long table, and she was present in all of it with the same full attention she had always given everything, because the capacity for attention was the thing she had always had, and she had stopped managing it in the direction of only what was safe to attend to. Kael ran. She ran with him when she was in Iron Fall, the black wolf and the dark chestnut wolf covering the 10 kilometers of forest in the early morning, in the cold and the rain and the brief window of summer warmth and back into the cold. The running was what it had been since the 3rd day. The thing that said everything that the library and the map room and the governance work could not, because some things were only sayable in motion, in the parallel ground covering of 2 wolves who had decided to go in the same direction. The legends about the Alpha King everyone feared did not disappear. Legends were durable in a way that actual change rarely was, and the Pax of the Seven Kingdoms had been building this particular legend for 4 years before Ashvale had sent its best option through the mountain passes with a treaty proposal and a bound collection of intelligence reports. What changed was the thing underneath the legend. The court that hosted it. The governance that the legend served. The king who had built the fear as an instrument and was now building, besides someone who was not afraid of him, the court the instrument had always been pointed toward. That was not the kind of thing that made it into a legend. It was too complex and too gradual and too much about the ordinary work of two people in a library in winter rather than about the battlefield or the throne. But it was the thing that was real. The thing her father had spent 11 years building toward. The thing she had traveled 9 days through the mountain passes to begin. The Alpha King everyone feared became, in the fullness of the work they did together and the time that settled it into permanence, the Alpha King whose court told him the truth. Which was, in the accounting of kingdoms and the people who built them, the most powerful thing he had ever been.